For those who might not be in Australia, it's our custom now to acknowledge our First Nations people when we meet on their land. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the First Nations people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered around this great Southland, and to acknowledge our gratitude that we share this land today, our sorrow for the costs of that sharing, and our hope that we can move to a place of justice and partnership together. And the prayer I've chosen is from a school I taught in for many years, and we had a Chisholm house in that school, that we still do. And the prayer that I've chosen is the Chisholm House prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, help me to follow the example of Carolyn Chisholm. Open my eyes to see the deepest needs of people. Move my hands to feed the hungry. Touch my heart that it may bring warmth to the despairing. Teach me generosity that welcomes strangers. Let me share the joy with others so that they may experience the richness of life. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Pat. And now it falls to me to introduce tonight's speakers. And I think Clara certainly will be known to many of you. Clara Gagan, who works for the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference as an executive secretary, but has also taught history at Catholic Theological College and other institutions, and has also worked for many years on the life of Caroline Chisholm. And I'm sure she'll tell you a lot more about that in a second. And our respondent is Rodney Stinson, who has actually written 2 books about Caroline, including one called Caroline Chisholm's Sea Judge Act, Caroline Chisholm's Lay Apostolate, Sea Judge Act, which of course brings us back to Joseph Cardine, the founder of the Young Christian Workers Movement and the inspiration of our Australian Cardine Institute, and also the inspiration of this seminar, because with the Australian Plenary Council coming up, or in a sense already in session, we've taken it upon ourselves to try and recall lay apostolate of lay people. So over to you, Clara.
Okay. Look, I guess what I really want to focus on is the fact that Caroline Chisholm is an example of what Vatican II calls the role of the laity, or what Vatican II defined as the role of the laity. And I think she was really prophetic in embodying this 100 years before the council was even called. And what I think is, well, the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium, says that lay people have a particular role in shining the light of Christ in those parts of the world where it would not otherwise shine. And the role of the laity is not to be mini-religious in the world, but to be authentically lay people, living their lives as one does, and in doing that, to bring the light of Christ and the love of Christ to the people they encounter. And I think Caroline Chisholm did that rather well. And it's interesting because someone like Henry Parkes, who was no friend of Catholics, said his newspaper in 1859 said that if Captain James Cook discovered Australia, if John MacArthur planted the first seeds of its extraordinary prosperity, if Ludwig Leichhardt penetrated and explored its before unknown interior, Caroline Chisholm has done much more. She has peopled. She alone has colonised in the true sense of the term. Now, colonisation might have negative connotations these days, but I think Caroline Chisholm was very interesting in her understanding of bringing people to Australia. She had a very, she commented at one stage that had there been more women in the colony, perhaps our Aboriginal, the Aboriginal peoples would have been treated better. And she also had a very sort of an understanding of sort of porous borders. She really wasn't very much in favour of the idea that Australia ought to be just a British place. At one stage, she spoke about allowing people from India to migrate to Australia. And she also said, and I think this is interesting on two counts, that if she were elected to the Legislative Assembly, and this is long before women had the vote, but if she were in the Legislative Assembly, she would deal with the Chinese question quite differently. So she was not anti-Chinese immigration either. So they're just a couple of interesting aspects about her as a person. And I think I want to look very, very briefly at what she achieved just as sort of dot points. But she was the first woman to publish on a matter of social policy in Australia when she published the response to the government on female immigration in 1841. She was the first woman to take a case to court and win when she sued the captain and surgeon of the ship, the Carthaginian, for maltreating a passenger. And it was described by the Solicitor General at the time as the most significant case in the colonies so far. She assisted the government by appearing before 3 commissions on immigration. And when she decided to establish a home for female immigrants, she approached the governor, and the governor is reported to have said when he met her that he had expected an old lady in a white cap and spectacles who would have talked to me about my soul. He says, I was amazed when my aide introduced a handsome, stately young woman who proceeded to reason the question as if she thought her experience worth as much as mine. She was in Australia, worked extensively in Australia, settled something like 11,000 people, went back to England and set up a process of family reunification for the families of prisoners who had left behind, the families, and there were cases where I know of personally, a family whose ancestors emigrated and they only brought 3 of their 5 children to Australia. The other 2 children were left with family, but ended up in a poorhouse. And through one of Caroline Chisholm's reunification schemes, they were brought out to Australia. She was keen to settle unemployed families in the countryside. She spoke out against the squattocracy. She travelled with her husband, gathering testimonials from settlers, which she took back to England, saying that, you know, these people had come out here with very little and had made a life for themselves. And those testimonials are collected in one of Rodney's books, and you can actually read the stories that people told about coming to Australia and settling successfully. So, and in the course of establishing the Family Colonisation Loan Society in England and bringing people out to Australia, she also reformed passenger shipping. And the interesting thing about that reform is her ships were the first ships to come to Australia without deaths on board. And that was mainly due to the fact that she didn't overcrowd her ships. So if the ships weren't overcrowded, people didn't catch disease and die, because her motivation was basically the respect for the dignity of the human person. And that bore itself out in a number of different ways. So she's in England. Well, let's put it into. She comes out to Australia in the 1840s, and her husband goes off to China during the Opium Wars because Archibald was an officer in the East India Company. So while Archibald is in China, she's in Sydney with 3 young children. And it's at this stage that she establishes the female barracks. Yes, she had the assistance of a governess who helped her with the children, but she did this work while her husband was away. When Archibald returns, they travel around New South Wales gathering these testimonials and then go back to England, set up the Family Colonisation Loan Society, bring families together and explain to them the needs that they will have in coming to Australia. These families migrate as groups of families, so they have people they know on the journey with them, which is, you know, incredibly an incredible sort of foresight. And they have to they couldn't afford to employ someone in Australia. So Archibald comes to Australia ahead of Caroline. Meanwhile, Caroline is in England with 5 of her 7 surviving children. She'd had 8 pregnancies at this stage, lost 3. And she was pregnant with the 9th child when Archibald left. So there she is in England, and she actually had to take the eldest boys out of school because she couldn't afford to keep them there. We hear a lot of talk about an option for the poor. She did this long before it was a term that's used in conversation. She then comes out to Australia 3 years later on a ship called the Ballarat, which might give you a clue as to what's happening in Australia. So she arrives in Melbourne in the middle of the gold rushes, and she immediately sees a need that the menfolk were going to the goldfields, but the women and children were being left behind in Melbourne. So she responds to the gold rushes by having built a series of shelter sheds between Melbourne and the Mount Alexander goldfields in what is now Castlemaine. And these shelter sheds were rudimentary buildings which provided accommodation and cooking facilities, and they were spaced at a day's walk apart. So immediately she sees a need and she's meeting that need. The family settle in Kyneton, where they try and set their eldest son up in a business venture which goes belly up because not less for the reason that the son dies and leaves a widow. But Caroline has to move to Sydney because of illness. And this results in Caroline and Archibald actually living in poverty. And there's a very moving account of that from J.K. Hayden, who he describes her as having been an instrument of so much good to so many in the colony, but she was reduced to teaching Chinese people English and baking in order to raise some money. So they basically, and then they end up in England where she dies of kidney disease. But what I think is interesting is that she had a vocation, and it was a secular vocation, which is what the role of the laity is. Her work arose out of a deep conviction that she was being called by God for a particular task. And if you read her booklet on female immigration, she talks about praying and fasting for the whole of Lent and feeling that on Easter Sunday, she made her offering to God and felt that he had accepted this and had gifted her in such a way as to be able to carry out the work she was called to do. Now, I think she should have been Australia's first saint, and I'm not alone in that. There's a number of others, and I'll come to that in a minute. But in some ways, I think her lack of recognition by the church is due to the fact that the work she did was not an official work of the church, but rather she acted within a personal jurisdiction for the welfare of all. Indeed, this was an argument that was raised against her canonisation by historian Malcolm Ellis in the pages of the Bulletin. Back in about 1966 or 67, I think, Timothy Sutter published his book on hierarchy and democracy in Australia. And he mentions in this book that he thought there were 2 saints in Australia, Caroline Chisholm and Archbishop Paulding. And in reviewing that book, now I'm forgetting his name, in reviewing that book, James Macaulay said that he thought Caroline Chisholm should have been Australia's first saint, even ahead of Mary MacKillop. And so Malcolm Ellis then argues against James Macaulay, and Ellis says, she cared not whether those she set out to succour were Jews, Lutherans, Calathumpians or humanists. If someone within her franchise needed help and she could give it, he got it. And interestingly, Philip Adams picks up on this same thing, and he says that he refers to Caroline Chisholm as a secular saint. And I think it's interesting that a professed atheist such as Adams makes recourse to saint as a descriptor. But even a Catholic would have to agree that she is a secular saint in the sense that she lived out her vocation in the world. Like the work of Dorothy Day, Caroline Chisholm did not set up an agency on behalf of the church. And I think her concept of vocation was summed up in her Easter promise, where she says, I was impressed with the idea that God had, in a particular manner, fitted me for this work, and yet I hesitated. My delay pressed on my mind as a sin, and when I heard of a poor girl suffering distress and losing her reputation in consequence, I felt that I was not clear of her sin, for I did not do all I could to prevent it. During the season of Lent that year, I suffered much, but on Easter Sunday, I was enabled at the altar of our Lord to make an offering of my talents to the God who gave them. I promised to know neither country nor creed, but to try and serve all justly and impartially. I asked only to be enabled to keep those poor girls from being tempted by their need to mortal sin, and resolved that to accomplish this, I would in every way sacrifice my feelings, surrender all comfort, nor in fact consider my own wishes or feelings, but devote myself to the work at hand. I felt my offering was accepted and God's blessing was on my work. So she had a secular vocation lived out in the world, but profoundly responsive to the call of God in her life. Her own understanding of vocation sits very well with the modern definition of the role of the laity. But I think that this is not even widely understood in the church today. The measure of a vocation is not subjective, but must be recognised and affirmed by others. Caroline identified her call and lived it to the best of her ability. She did not seek fame or recognition, but her call was recognised by others. While recognising the holiness of her motives and her work, there appears to be an ambivalence or a tension between the religious and the secular, in the language of the commentators I've referred to. Ellis and Adams wish to place her firmly in the secular or non-religious world, and others wish to locate her in a more exclusively religious setting. But an intriguing assessment of her work comes from the view of Aeneas Mackenzie in his Memoirs of Caroline Chisholm, published in the English journal The Lamp. And Mackenzie writes, Mrs. Chisholm is a sound, practical Catholic. She believes in and practices in an eminent degree the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, with the self-abnegation of a sister of charity. In fact, she's in every sense of the word a sister of charity. And her vocation is evidently from God. She was called to do a work. She heard the still small voice, and like a good Christian, she obeyed it, with a perseverance and earnestness worthy of imitation and admiration. The greatest reason why the mission of each individual Christian is not equally successful is because they do not act like Mrs. Chisholm has done, to set first about to discover their vocation in a proper way and carry it out under every circumstance. Now, I would argue that that is what Vatican II called lay people to do, to discern their vocation and to live it out. And interestingly, Mackenzie refers to Caroline Chisholm, makes a comparison between Caroline Chisholm and the Sisters of Charity and places her on par with them. Now, I referred earlier to Timothy Sutter, who identifies that same struggle in Caroline's contemporaries, particularly Archbishop Paulding. He says Paulding really did not understand what she was about. And this is quoting from Sutter. She was the most influential lay Catholic in Paulding's jurisdiction. She knew the immigrant poor and had an almost magical ability to get them what they wanted: food, shelter, work, marriage. She had immense organisational ability, a talent for accurate statistical generalisation, an eye for the moral bearings of economic factors, a shrewdness to read the heart, and she had the graces of prayer. Paulding completely failed to grasp her importance. His country was ready for a lay and social apostolate conducted by women, as Mrs. Chisholm proved, but he had no language with which to take possession of such a concept. Hers was an apostolic sanctity beyond the range of vision, not of Paulding alone, but of most of her contemporaries, except a few distinguished Protestants like Shaftesbury, Dickens, Florence Nightingale, but also Pius IX. And Sutter makes a second observation, which may be close to the crux of the matter. And he says, one feels that had her marriage been a sad affair, like Mrs. Seaton's or Mrs. Connolly, and had she in consequence become a nun, as they did, Paulding would have taken her to his heart. But her bed knew no sorrow or discord, no pain, but the triumphant pain of childbirth itself. So that's interesting. So I come back to this idea of the lay vocation is lived in the world. And, you know, to quote a theologian who's close to the heart of the Cardine movement, Eve Congar said that lay people are Christians in the world, there to do God's work insofar as it must be done in and through the work of the world. And I think we haven't, as a church, grasped the worldliness of the secular vocation of the laity. And especially we have not grasped that we may attain holiness in and through the world. The role of the laity is not essentially involvement in the affairs of the church, although some people are called to that. Too often, the post-Vatican II era, which has been hailed as the age of the laity, where this is taken to mean the involvement of laity in ecclesial functions. That is not the role of the laity. Some lay people may have ecclesial vocations, but in fulfilling those vocations, they are still part of the hierarchy. Whereas in working in the world, they act within their own, within the jurisdiction of their own baptismal vocation. And I use the example of Dorothy Day as well. You know, she wasn't acting on behalf of the church, but she was acting as a baptized person bringing Christ to the world. And it's that bringing Christ to the world that is the lay vocation. It involves being comfortable in the world in order to preach Christ. For most, this is deceptively simple. And they must feel, I think often lay people feel there needs to be something more. But, you know, basically what we're, you know, to quote someone like Catherine of Siena, be who God meant you to be and you will set the world on fire. Caroline Chisholm became who she was meant to be, and that bore ample fruit. But somehow I don't think this has permeated our Catholic consciousness, and a simple sort of straw poll of the average person's perceptions of holiness, I think, is the response to the canonisation of St Mary of the Cross, and then suggestions for other female saints such as Sister Irene McCormack, Sister Mary Glowry. Now we're hearing Eileen O'Connor, and they're all women who've had an association with some religious order or some official Catholic institution. Now, I think it's interesting. sorry, I'm just looking at some notes here I have. But yeah, I see Caroline Chisholm as an embodiment of the lay vocation. And I think it's interesting, if we look at Christopher Daly's Laity of John Paul II, he talked about the role of the laity in promoting the dignity of the human person. He lists 8 things: fostering respect for life, supporting religious liberty, assisting marriage and family, carrying out works of charity, serving in public life, promoting social and economic justice, and engaging in the evangelisation of culture. Now, I have elsewhere made a case for Caroline fitting each one of those 8 points, whereas I don't think John Paul II expected one person to do it all, but find the area that you're comfortable in, that you're gifted in, and move ahead in that area. But as I say, Caroline Chisholm embodied them all. I mean, in terms of social justice, she basically invented, she set up Australia's first free employment agency. And when she was finding jobs for the girls, she had local groups in different regions who were her representatives, but all of these girls were employed under a contract, and all of these contracts were written in triplicate, one for the girl, one for the employer, and one for Mrs. Chisholm, to make sure that their rights were upheld. The other thing she did is she spoke out against the practice of a lot of squatters having bachelor stations, because bachelor stations only attracted rations for single men. But she argued that families needed to be recognised, that there had to be a just wage that supported a family. And in a lot of those things, in the right to private property, in the right to a fair wage, in the right to emigrate, she actually preempted Rerum Novarum by about 14 years. Rerum Novarum was written 14 years after she died, and she had been espousing all of those principles. So the other thing I think interesting is, you know, in the past, some people became saints on the basis of public acclaim. Now, we already have somebody in the audience who mentioned earlier that he teaches in a school in Brisbane named after Caroline Chisholm. And I know there's a school in Parramatta named after Caroline Chisholm, and there's a school in Melbourne, in Braybrook, named after Caroline Chisholm. There's also a government, well, those 3 are all Catholic. Oh, and someone was telling me there's one in Perth. There's a government school in Canberra named the Caroline Chisholm High School, and the Department of, who are they now? The welfare body, Department of Human Services, their headquarters is named the Caroline Chisholm Centre because of the acknowledgement of the work she did in the area of social welfare. The other thing I find fascinating is in Goulburn, there is a mosaic on the side of the old Pro-Cathedral of Caroline Chisholm. In St Ignatius Church in Melbourne, the Jesuit church in Richmond, there is a stained glass window of Caroline Chisholm, and there's a stained glass window of Mary MacKillop, and next to that is Caroline Chisholm. I discovered in the church in Curtin in the ACT, there are 4 women depicted in a window: Caroline Chisholm, Mary MacKillop, Teresa of Avila, and Catherine of Siena. So she's right in there with the big guns. And I think the most amusing one has to be St Mary's Hamilton in Victoria, where there are 2 windows. One is Mary MacKillop, and the other is a woman in a bonnet and a shawl. And at the bottom, there's something that looks like a cloud, like a piece of glass that's waiting for an inscription. And it's quite clear that the person depicted in that window is Caroline Chisholm. So if that isn't evidence of public acclaim, I'm not sure what is. But in the course of my job, I come across a number of bishops, and I ran into the president of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference a few weeks ago, and I sort of made some joke about wanting to live in Italy, but I would only live in Italy if I became the postulator for the cause of Caroline Chisholm. And he says, you know, I tried to do something about that when I was in Canberra, but, you know, there wasn't a lot of public enthusiasm. And I'm thinking, who was he talking to? And what was he looking for? I think all those things that I've mentioned are public enthusiasm. I know with Caroline Chisholm College in Braybrook, it is a coming together of 3 schools. One was called St John's, one was called Caroline Chisholm College, and the other was Christ the King. And when the parents and the school councils came together to discuss the name of the integrated school, Caroline Chisholm won hands down. So I guess that's the sort of thing I've been putting forward. I think what we need, and I did put in a submission to the plenary council saying that Australia should recognise Caroline Chisholm as a saint, and that is an echoing of there was a lay conference in the 1970s, and there was actually a resolution there to promote the cause for Caroline Chisholm. I think that there are lay saints. I think the particularly interesting thing about Caroline is all the issues that she dealt with, you know, the treatment of women, the treatment of Aborigines, the treatment of migrants. They're all issues that are still very, very current today. I think the other thing to note is her husband, Archibald. Without Archibald offered her support from the very beginning. When he proposed to her, she told him that she didn't think she'd make a good officer's wife because she felt a call to serve the less fortunate. And so she sent him away and told him not to come back for a month and to think about the implications of this. And when he came back, he said that he would support her in whatever she felt called to do. And indeed, he did, in a very, very real way. And what I find interesting is when I talk about Caroline Chisholm, and in other presentations I've given, I'm sort of a bit more thorough in her achievements. And even in secular audiences, I see people sort of developing a few bits of sweat on their brow thinking, oh my goodness, that's an awful lot of work. How did she do it? And I think the only way she did it was through the Holy Spirit. She was able to articulate policies on justice and employment, fair wages, right to private property, as I said, all of those before Rerum Novarum even spoke about them. And then I want to quote Benedict XVI, who said, he made a comment that what is needed in terms of our attitude to the laity is a change in mindset, particularly concerning lay people. And he says, lay people must no longer be viewed as collaborators of the clergy, but truly recognised as co-responsible for the church's being and action, thereby fostering the consolidation of a mature and committed laity. I think someone like Caroline Chisholm accepted her co-responsibility for the mission of the church. She lived her life in a unique, creative way, according to her circumstances within her jurisdiction and according to the needs of those she served. It wasn't an ecclesial work, but a work of service to others and the means by which, as a layperson, she was called to fulfill her vocation in and through the world. So, you know, the bottom line is I don't think she'll ever get to first base if there isn't some support from the church. But I think in the meantime, I certainly continue to promote her as a model of the role of the laity and as being prophetic of the church's teaching in this area. So that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Clara. That was wonderful. As an alumnus of St John's College, Braybrook, now part of Caroline Chisholm College, it's particularly meaningful for me. And wow, that's really brought to life not only her life, but also the whole Vatican II thing of the lay apostolate in the world, not just in the church. I'm sure they're already in the chat. We've got a couple of questions, but before we do move to the questions, I think it'd be best if we asked Rodney to just give his response, and then the floor will be open to everybody, because I'm sure everybody's got lots to ask or add. Rodney, could I hand over to you?
Certainly. Thank you, Stefan. There's so much I could say, but I'll pick up with Clara's reference to Carolyn's book, Female Immigration Considered. Clara read some of the heartfelt expressions of her religious beliefs that she enacted in practical charity. Unfortunately, that particular book was really her only extended example of her personal Christian faith and the rationale and reasoning for her work. There are some letters to the newspapers in 1840, mainly in response to John Dunmore Lang's Reverend John Dunmore Lang, a Presbyterian, who attacked her quite savagely, questioning her motives. And she responded there with one uneven letter, but basically there was a very strong response from her, which said, can she not be able to practice her religion in her own way, as she had allowed Muslims and Hindus and others in India to practice theirs. So it was really an expression of freedom of religious belief against a Christian minister, but it was effective. But other than that, and a couple of letters, and the later letter that Clara quoted from, which is Carolyn's almost despairing, if not, well, highly despondent, if not despairing letter to then Bishop Ullathorne, who had been, of course, a priest in Sydney in the 1830s, leaving in the 1840s to go back to England. But she got on well with him, and she opened her heart to him. But beyond those, there's really not very much. So we're forced back with this person of practical charity to see what she did. And we have very little information as to how she acquired her firm grasp of practical Christian charity. She grew up in an Anglican family, practicing, and she knew scriptures, although she didn't quote them as liberally as some others at the time did. She was very firmly someone who, for whom it was the centre of her life. She met Archibald, and again, you know, we only have some little snippets of what developed between them as a meeting of the minds and hearts. But then we don't have much at all for the later 1830s, working in India. It's rather a sternly worded record of her setting up the home of industry for the girls of half European fathers, but soldiers and local women, and they were running the streets and, you know, being subjected to uncalled for recruitment to whatever you can just guess. But she alludes to that, but she set up that. We don't know whether she was really lacking confidence. Mary Hoban surmised as much, but we don't know. So there are lots of periods in her life where we don't have really solid records. She gets to Sydney with Archibald on leave, and almost within days of our arriving, they both see a need and act on it. That was the Scottish woodchire cutters. And it went on from there, taking people into their homes and so on. But the female immigration book really is, as I mentioned before, the only really solid explanation of her Christian motivation. But throughout, what she was most successful in doing is not just seeing and through very sharp observation, but judging, and assessing, and then doing something about it. That is acting. So I've just mixed up, the Cardine, principles, but she didn't ever formulate them in that sort of quite clear way. But it's what she did. So we see from her actions what sort of person she really was. And over time, as more and more came to be aware of her, she recruited people from all Christian denominations. Well, perhaps not so much from the Presbyterians to begin with, but later on. I've got two of the big tomes behind me. I can't quite see them there, but one was the very first history of Australia, written by a chap called David Blair, and another of his books called the First Encyclopedia of Australia. Caroline Chisholm gets roughly double the mention of Bishop Polding, or Archbishop Polding as he was by the time of publication, 1878, for the Encyclopedia, and about 3 times as much in the history. So, because Polding wasn't mentioned in the history of Australia. And David Blair was a Presbyterian minister who left the ministry, then went on to be a journalist and so on. So he had no religious axe to grind, far from it. And so she managed to bring people together. And only every now and then there were occasional opponents. Just as now, even Ellis was a bit of an opponent in mid-century, 20th century. Then, of course, Anne Summers' hostile reception of Mary Hoban's work, which still resonates with certain types of female historians or female analysts. I was going to say secular feminists, but I think it's a bit too hackneyed, but they're getting it wrong all the time. I was going to write another article for the newsletter, just outlining some of that. But no, she really did keep on with her work, despite any opposition that did crop up. And when the opposition did arise, she, as for instance, in setting up the female immigration home, which was to be temporary, the Anglicans were dubious that she might be really just a secret Roman Catholic proselytizer. And so she met with the minister nominated by the Anglican bishop. That's Bishop, Minister, what was his name, Clara?
Sorry, I was looking at the questions.
Anyway, so and he was satisfied, and so it went on. As time went on, there were occasional opponents, but she always seemed to win people over. So I'm not sure how much time I've got, Stefan. Is it another couple of minutes? Or?
Yeah, another couple of minutes, sure. Yeah.
So I guess what I'd be looking at really is my interest is, as I'm a bit discouraged by the Australian Catholic bishops. And my main reason for that in the present matter is that, just as Clara referred to the 1976 National Conference of the Laity passing a resolution that requesting the Australian bishops to look at commencing a cause, the following year, that's 1977, a letter did go from the Australian Bishops' Conference to the Archbishop of Westminster at the time, which is where Caroline died. And the protocol is for before the commencement of any cause, or even preparatory to the cause, the historical study to establish a rogue sanctity, the ordinary in the diocese or archdiocese where she died had to either carry that out himself or have it carried out, or allow another diocese, and it wasn't another diocese that would approach him, to take on that role. So what happened was a letter went out from the Australian Bishops' Conference, and it referred to the national, it did not refer to the National Conference of Catholic Laity's resolution, but instead said that there were some, minimised the interest, saying there were some Catholics who were interested in the matter. And then it concludes that the matter is not one of top priority or urgency as far as the Australian bishops are concerned. So in other words, puts forward a fairly limp expression of some interest in the Australian Church. And then what do we have afterwards? Well, the contact that sent me a copy of that letter told me that their understanding is that there was no reply from Westminster, there was no follow-up, and 41 years later, as far as I'm aware, no further approach has been made to Westminster. So nothing can be done about having an official historical study undertaken. One was commenced, and that's actually, I look at in issue number 18 of the newsletter, which is available online at Chisholm.com. Mary Hoban, back in 1964, was reportedly asked by the Archbishop of Melbourne to carry out a study. She did that, but some of the quotes that attributed to her suggest that she overstepped the mark in understanding her role. But eventually it was the book that had 51 Pieces of Wedding Cake that resulted in the early 70s. The historical study could not go ahead, even though she'd done certain work, because it wasn't the right protocol. So we're really stuck. If the bishops aren't convinced, or simply don't want to do anything, we'll have Caroline Chisholm as a real outstanding example of a Christian leader and worker in this country, acknowledged outside the church in fulsome ways, and in some ways in the church, in the way some of the examples that Clara has given. The bishops will continue to have a hands-off approach. So I'm basically pessimistic. But more work can be done historically, but there's not a great deal more that can be mined, to be honest. So that'll be about me at the moment, I think, Stefan.
Well, thank you very much, Rod. Yeah, well, I mean, it might be a little bit disappointing where it's got to at the moment, but here we are, 34 of us online right now, and the second session of the Plenary Council coming up in almost a few weeks. So I don't know if anybody among the participants would like to add a few words about how we could take this further or pose your questions. I see in the chat, I'm sorry, actually, we've got a wrong setting on the chat, and people's chat comes only to me, not to everybody, but I've copied for everybody Dave Maloney's question. Are you able to see that, Clara?
Yes, yes, I can see that.
You might like to take that up for a start?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting. There are a number of interesting Protestants, some of whom became Catholic, like Caroline Chisholm, and the other is Cardinal Manning. Manning was an evangelical Anglican clergyman who became a Catholic and became a very prominent figure in the whole social justice debate. He may well have been one of the sort of shadow writers of Rerum Novarum, and he was certainly active in England during the famous dock strike, seen to be visiting the strikers on the docks. Interesting too, I nearly fell back down the stairs. I was at the Trades Hall building in Ballarat, And if you go to the meeting room upstairs, there is this huge portrait of Cardinal Manning done by an artist who did a lot of work painting trade union banners. But he painted this portrait of Manning, and there it is still hanging in the meeting room of the Ballarat Trades Hall. So there have been a number of evangelical Anglicans who've become Catholics, who've enriched our own Catholic social justice teaching. So I don't know, David, if that approaches an answer. And I think, I think you're entirely right. We need to have a more fulsome understanding of the lay apostolate in the church in Australia, because I think, and I mean, even if anyone's followed the plenary council debates, it's all about exercising authority in the church. Now, the church is really a small place. We're actually called to bring the light of Christ into all the world, not just the church. So I wouldn't like to see the role of the laity confined to being father's helpers.
Can I make comment here?
Sure. Yes.
Mary Ganley. I'm currently writing a history of the Catholic Diocese of Rockhampton. I just taking you up, Clara, on Suter's comment that Paulding had no language to acknowledge and recognise Caroline Chisholm as a leader in lay leadership in the early church. And just as an aside, I don't think there's any language at the moment that recognises women in lay leadership in the church. That's just an aside. But I think the histories of the Catholic Church have been written by men for men, mostly. So people like Caroline Chisholm, even though lay men in her era were given a good ride by historians of the Catholic Church. What I think we may have to what I'm thinking, listening to the wonderful work you've done, we may have to let go of the idea of her being a saint in the church, and we have to let go of and let her be a significant person in Australian history, written for Australia. And by the way, she was Christian Catholic. That to me, I think, is the only way that someone like Caroline Chisholm is going to be recognised as a national figure of significance. And she was significant, not just in New South Wales and Victoria. I've read of what she did once she arrived in Moreton Bay and in Queensland. So she is a national significant figure. And I just wonder if when women start writing about women, and we perhaps have to lift her out of that ecclesiastical category, she may get the recognition that she should get.
I guess my only comment there is a lot of the work I do has been in the area of evangelisation. It has been in the area of lay formation. And we talk about the role of the laity. And here is a brilliant example of what laity can be. And we're not even looking there. It's like we're sort of sticking our head back in the sand. So what are lay people called to do? Give us some examples, and they can't. They can only give us clerical or religious examples.
Exactly. In my history, I'm telling the women's story. So it's a slow journey in Australia for women to tell women's stories about their evangelising action in the church right from the word go.
Absolutely.
But they've been written out of history. They've been written out of history.
Well, I'm working for the Catholic bishops, and one of the issues I'm dealing with at the moment is the ministry of catechists, which the Pope has instituted as a lay ministry. Now,
Yeah.
my own research, my own doctoral research, looking at the Diocese of Sandhurst, when the first bishop visited the people up the Mitta River, what did he find? Women who had been instructing children for sacraments and all the rest of it. The priests hardly ever got there. So women were fulfilling this role of catechist long before it's become a ministry for lay people. And it's part of the history of Australia. Priests didn't get to a lot of places very often, and it was women on the ground who were doing the work.
Could I just jump in there with my own comment on this issue of women's stories not being told? Well, I'm happy to just let everybody know that ACI has just recently launched a new project. We call it the Joseph's Women Leaders Project, precisely with the objective of highlighting the stories of so many women Joseph's leaders from around the world who did fantastic things with the YCW, the YCS, and other lay apostolate movements. And maybe some of you here with us tonight might know some of those stories. So I've put in the chat there the link to the site. So if you do have anything to share, we're real interested to tell some of those stories and make them known. We're working with Catherine Massam. I don't know, some of you may know Catherine Massam, professor at the University of Divinity and Pilgrim College, also a former YCS leader. So yeah, that's just a little bit of publicity, but trying to address that issue of women's stories being left out.
Stefan,
Yes, Mick.
apropos of that is, it's an interesting thing that the first conference of the St. Vincent de Paul Society was a conference of women down near Geelong in Victoria. And that was the first conference of the St. Vincent de Paul in Victoria at any rate. So it was the women leading the way there.
Yeah, I think it's true in many instances, in many fields. So there's work for us to do and encourage students, future students, to take up some of that research. Yep. Now, I can't see everybody. Maybe I'll switch the screen. Has anybody else got a question or a comment that they'd like to jump in with? Feel free to jump in or put up your hand. I can't see everybody, so if I don't highlight you, just feel free to jump in. If not, there is one particular question I'd like to pose to both Clara and Rod. Well, what can we do? Clara, your submission on Caroline Chisholm, have you got any feedback from the plenary? How has that been received? Is there any signs that that'll be taken up?
I don't think it made the instrumentum laboris, which was not adhered to during the plenary council anyway. So.
Well, is there anything we can do in the next 2-3 months that might, bring it to the fore?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I think the plenary council has its own agenda and has its own issues. Yeah, I wouldn't know how to, unless there are some delegates here who want to bring it up.
How would we do that?
Are there any delegates here? Does anyone know any delegates to the plenary council? They're really the only people who have a voice in that.
I hadn't thought about it, but I do know some actually. I know two in particular that are delegates. One is a woman, young woman, working way in the bush, and she's holding the church together way out there. Huge job, running a property with a mother and running the church, Catholic Church. Yes, she is a delegate. I'm sure she'd be open to something like that, Clara. I'd be interested in handing her that.
Yes, I can send you a copy. I could send you a copy of the submission I made. It was very brief. It was only a couple of pages. But send me your... Well, I'm going to put my email here. You can contact me on this email. Anyone who has any information or wants any information. And yeah, if you send me your details, then I can send you the submission.
Thank you.
I see that
Just
Patrick,
posted that in.
oh, sorry, I was just saying Patrick Marnie has made a comment in the chat. Patrick, would you like to say a few words about that? Where's Pat? I also see James Franklin has added a point there that the website and journal of the Australian Catholic Historical Society are open to more on Caroline's story. So there's another avenue. Shall I read Patrick's comment? There was in Mrs. Chisholm's day a hard division between the secular and religious roles and status in the church. It is still, oh, Patrick, you're there now. Would you like to speak on that?
Yes, I just think that there's this hard division, which is way past its use by date, between the religious and the secular. I asked my bishop at the time, Peter Ingham, he was preaching against the secularization of our society. What's the opposite? And he said spiritual. And I've thought a lot about that since. Well, anyone who adheres to religion of any kind has a spiritual side and a secular side, you know, especially laity. We live in the world, and whatever we do, where especially if you follow Vatican II documents, we're asked to influence that with our spirituality, which is what, yeah. So I just think that it's an artificial barrier, and I think that's probably what influenced Caroline Chisholm's bishop to sort of lock her out of any, you know, recognition. But you know, let's get over it. That's the way forward for the apostolate of the laity to recognise that we are all spiritual as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right, and that's why I use that quote from Eve Conger, in that the laity find their mission in and through the world, not by escaping from it. You know, we're not, as lay people, called to go and live on a mountain and contemplate God. We're to find God in the material of our everyday lives.
Yes, and we all know lay people who do that.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, probably most of us are unfortunate enough to know religious who do the opposite. You know, they shelter in that world of the role of the religious.
But you know, in terms of Vatican II, and I think Pope Francis is very strong on this, the role of the ordained is to equip the laity for their mission in the world. It's not a withdrawal from it, and it's not taking the laity out of the world, but it's a missioning and a serving that mission of the laity.
I ask another question then. Do you think priests or seminarians are trained with that concept of their ministry in mind?
Having taught some of them, no. I remember having an argument in a class where a student, a seminarian, told me that, you know, the vocation to priesthood was of a higher calling. And I said, absolutely, it's not of a higher calling. We all have the same level of call. And if you're trying to be a priest and you're not actually called to be a priest, you're not likely to be a very good priest. And one of the other students said, yeah, you know, what she's saying straight out of Vatican II. But interestingly, the student who was a seminarian at the time who defended me has left the seminary and is now a married man. So he found his vocation not in the seminary.
Stefan, could I?
Yeah, go on, Carl. Go for it, Carl.
I mentioned something.
Yep.
I think the earlier broadcast of the Cardine Institute, whose work I applaud tremendously, focused on the Campion Society with Colin Jory and Richard Doig, and the fruits of that, particularly with the Australian Catholic rural movement. And I think those are examples in our own tradition, in our own Australian Catholic history, that it's worthwhile paying attention to, and we don't give enough attention to show the ways in which lay people work in the world, in the environment in which they live, in their families, in their workplaces, in their neighbourhoods, very different from those who live a clerical or religious life. And I think the risk we face at present is the extent to which lay people, however worthily they may be involved, will become clericalised. That is, that they see their function essentially as assisting in a very worthy way the priests at Mass, and reading at Mass, distributing communion, all of which are very important roles to perform. But the particular role, the distinctive role that religious and priests can't perform, that the laity are called to, and the Campion tradition testifies to, is how do we convert the world? How do we challenge the culture? How do we confront it in the best sense with a strong positive vision of Christian love and values? And I think the Campion tradition is one that needs to be studied and recaptured by our people in our own country.
Yes, great comment, Carl. And also we, of course, in the Cardine tradition, we know owe a lot to the Campions, in particular Kevin Kelly, but not only Kevin. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if there's anybody else that's got any particular questions or comments that they'd like to add. If not, if you do, I think now's the time to put your hand up or speak up, because otherwise we'll draw to a close, I think. Yeah. Do you have any final words you'd like to share with us, Rod?
I think there has to be some sort of game changer. And I think that lies in convincing someone to either in a mini-series or a good film, present Chisholm visually. Because to be honest, the most effective of the biographies was the earliest, 1950, Margaret Kiddle's. And there have been four major ones since, but none have had the same beneficial impact as Kiddle's own book. Each of the later ones has, well, most of the later ones have added something, more that's of value. But without the visuals, I don't think we're going to get anyone younger than the participants to really be all that interested. There has to be something to capture the imagination. The written word, it doesn't seem to really work much anymore in this sort of like this line of promotion, really. So I ideally want Carolyn Chisholm to be better known, but I'm not the one to write an effective summation of the and compilation of all the biographies. We need a really good writer or a screenwriter, more especially, and have it carried out. And I suppose the Australian bishops would probably respond better to a 2.5-hour film than being suggested to them that they read, a number of the biographies that might take them a week and a half to read.
Well, there's a challenge. Clara, would you like to say any final words or comments?
Look, I would just like to thank you for the opportunity to have had this forum. Yeah, I guess I'm a bit frustrated too. And as Marie picked up with Timothy Sutter and holding not having the language to deal with such a concept. I think the church in Australia still doesn't have the language to deal with such a concept, and that's really, really sad, because while I'm a big fan of Caroline Chisholm, I am also, I think, very much engaged in the whole issue of evangelisation. And I think if we don't have the right sort of imagination, that project's not going to go very far either. So yeah, I think we need to reimagine how lay people live out their faith, and perhaps not so much as reimagine, but perhaps rediscover. As Carl mentioned earlier, you know, the Campions had the right idea, but there's very few of us around in the church who still grasp that.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think both of you left us with a lot of challenges. We are kind of a small number of us here. Sometimes I feel that we're on a little bit of a different track from the plenary council. But anyway, hopefully there are a few contacts that we have with members of the plenary who are open to the sorts of things that you've presented. And over the next few days, hopefully, I'll see if I can get this video edited with a few of the glitches out of it and post it up on YouTube. And then I guess it'll be up to us, the challenge, to share the good news of Caroline Chisholm's lay apostolate with everybody we can, including the members of the plenary council. So I think I'd just like to thank both of you, particularly. It's as I said, it's got a personal meaning for me, coming from that background at Old St. John's College, now part of Chisholm College. And yeah, it really fits in very well with the whole Cardine tradition of promoting the lay apostolate. And again, Rod summed that up very good in the title of his book. So I really feel we're kind of keen to keep this conversation going, and we look forward to the future. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Stella.
Good. Thanks. Yep.
Thank you so much.